Okay, we are live on YouTube. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. My name's John. I'm one of the hosts of SU21 Digital. Joining us today is Aidan, the CEO of Elbow Space, a digital company who's going to talk a little bit about data-driven. Thank you very much. Sorry, I want to mute the YouTube thing. My name's John. I'm one of the hosts of SU21 Digital. Joining us today is Aidan, the CEO of Elbow Space. There we go. So apologies for that. And yeah, over to Aidan. I will pass over to him. If you've got any questions as we're going on, please put those in the chat and I will give Aidan a prompt if he hasn't seen them. And yeah, thank you all for joining us. Over to Aidan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for turning up. It's greatly appreciated. So yeah, we're going to talk about today we're going to be talking about everything kind of data-driven and how to become a data-driven students' union. So a very quick kind of intro about myself. So I've been working kind of in or with student unions for knocking on kind of 10 years or so now. Started off at York St John's Students' Union as their society's assistant about 10 years ago. Moved across then to being their digital development coordinator, while in that post kind of doing things like building software for the union. Then moved across to University of York and did a big project with them, helping to rebuild their digital library platform. And then since then, I've moved across to being CEO and lead software developer of Elbow Space. So Elbow Space, again, in a nutshell, is just a software company aimed at providing powerful, easy to use software to SUs. So if you want to check out Elbow Space, there's a link for our website and things, my LinkedIn at the end of the presentation. The big thing kind of throughout all of the roles that I've mentioned was understanding kind of the power of data. And being really aware that how pivotal it was in understanding the why users engage with things like the software that I was building or the services that I was helping to support, and kind of allowing us to understand and measure those interactions so that we can kind of drive these constant improvements. So I hope kind of from this presentation, you understand the potential of data and how it can transform your union. So anyway, that's enough about me. Let's kind of get talking about it. So these are the things that we're going to cover today. The main outcome of the talk is to look at a few different ways as they become more of a data-driven organisation. So that includes looking at things like metrics, dashboarding, analytics, and then a few parts kind of about digitising processes, just kind of tie all those together. If you do have any questions, we'll kind of take them a bit more toward the end because some of it kind of builds on it. So it might find that you've got a question, but actually it might get answered in the next slide or so. Don't worry about taking too many notes because obviously this is recorded, but I will also circulate the presentation around as well, just in case you've got anything on there as well. So yes, let's start with metrics. A few examples, kind of the good, the bad and the ugly. Starting off with the ugly when it comes to metrics. So the worst type of metric from my perspective, and I think should be kind of distilled to unions, is this idea of vanity metrics. So vanity metrics are metrics that make you look good to others, but don't really help you understand your performance and don't really inform future strategies. That's a definition from Tableau. It's not something that I've made up, so there's a link in the description as well. So an example of this could be, we got 23% turnout for our elections last year. So that's something that, it doesn't necessarily inform things. It's just something that's kind of this is how good we were. So kind of then on to the bad. So an example of this could be, this is what we've always done because an X percentage of students turn up each week, which is a bit better because you're starting to use statistics a bit more powerfully, but you're not kind of using them quite towards more of a cause and effect. So one of the big things then is how do we take that sort of metric and how do we make it into a good or even a great metric? Okay. So ideally you want metrics that always have an action. So you can always do something from a metric. Otherwise it's not very useful. There's not much point. So that could be used for something, whether that's kind of to reduce or increase. So for an example of that could be looking at kind of your device cases and ideally want to reduce those because your student sport's doing well. Or you want to maybe increase election voter turnout in general. Again, we'll go into a bit more detail about those in a sec. So here's a kind of an example of how we can turn this idea of a bad metric into a good metric, or at least into a more usable metric. So your bad one is something like that percentage turnout of the student body in an election. That's something that I've seen, something that we did have on York St John's strat plan a few years ago. And we kind of moved it away from something a bit more useful. So a way that we can turn this into potentially kind of a good one, and we'll talk about a bit later how potentially more of a great metric, is looking at the percentage turnout of something like college school faculty relative to that overall turnout. So it's how you kind of break that down because then you can put an action together into that. So yeah, the main reason that that is a better metric is because, as I say, it's got that action. You're able to then potentially target a group of students and to potentially push further engagement with those students for an election. And then obviously, depending on which kind of COVID restrictions, could go and kind of actually try and reach out to those people in those students in person, sort of thing, and get them to vote. And as I said, we'll talk a little bit later how we turn this kind of a good metric now into a great metric going forward. So now we have a bit of understanding about this overarching what are metrics, and we could kind of look about, well, how do we actually use those? How do they fit into this bigger picture? And then how do we actually, get there? So the two kind of main approaches to becoming a data-driven students' union, or at least two that we're going to kind of cover today, and two that I think are really powerful for SUs. The first being a question-driven approach, and the second being an investigatory approach. So a question-driven approach, very much in the title, kind of makes sense. You start with this idea of a question, and you start building up your data dashboards or analytics from there. So you then try and find data that gives you further insight into that, looking at things like qualitative and quantitative data. For example, a kind of typical question could be, how well did our elections go last year? So the whole point of this is that it's a starting point. It's not necessarily that metric, but it's that starting point. And then from there, you kind of build information around that to build a bigger picture. The biggest drawback to this is kind of the potential data that you leave out of scope. So you might find that something that you say, this chunk of data you might perceive as not actually being useful, that actually could be one of the missing pieces to a further understanding and kind of further bit of context. So for example, for an elections dashboard, you might do something like emit previous events from the last year, as they wouldn't kind of seem connected, because you might just say, look at just your elections week. But for example, what if attendees at your freshers events or your welcome fair events actually did correlate to your voter turnout? You might find that that starts their initial journey on engagement with the union. So you might have kind of left out a very key piece of information. The outcome then of this question-driven approach is very much to build a kind of single dashboard looking at this single question, with where all of the topics, all of the metrics and data on there is around this one topic in question. So yeah, so flipping to this other approach then is very much this investigatory approach. This is a great great kind of approach once you've got that buy-in. That's kind of one of the pros and cons to these. And once staff have started to see that power of data, but it can take a bit longer. Because for this, rather than say looking at this single strand of information, a single question, you're actually going to be looking at kind of the students' union as a whole, looking at kind of how each of these different strands engage with the union, how the union fits into the kind of higher ed wider context, and very much looking at kind of the student movement rather than saying, how good did my elections do? So yeah, so you're very much you're going to build a lot of kind of more of a framework from this, maybe rather than a single dashboard. So you might end up building a framework that looks maybe at, say, a specific department and then build from there. And that kind of allows you to do those kind of more in-depth questions. There is kind of a longer term benefit to this because it allows you to be a bit more generic in that data that you've got in those dashboards. So you can ask, say it's your student voice team, you can ask looking at that elections data in the first instance, but then maybe you can do something, say, on advice, if that, say, sits in that team as well. So it's a lot more useful kind of over the long term because you can use that for 1 to maybe 2 years. It is technically possible to build this way, starting off from a question-driven approach. What you can do is kind of build that through multiple iterations and kind of build it up. It very much depends kind of on your union. If you're kind of started this journey about being data-driven, this might make more sense because you might have more buy-in. Whereas actually, if you're just coming to it, it might make more sense to do the question-driven approach. A big thing kind of to touch on about data and being data-driven. So you've done this, you've started pulling your data together, maybe you've done one of your first dashboards. But the thing is, you want to make sure that you're getting staff involved with the data as much as possible. So a big thing you want to make sure you're doing is making this data accessible to absolutely everyone in your organisation. I was thinking about this earlier. You ideally, if possible, want to almost get your student staff access to this, and even obviously, pending where appropriate, actually giving your actual students themselves access to this. Obviously, making sure that it's GDPR compliant and everything. But actually kind of making sure that your data is democratized and that everyone has access to it. In theory, it's going to make you more transparent as a union. It hopefully should increase engagement because students can see it as well. Then they're kind of very much able to manage that transparency. But your big thing is, just make sure that even if some staff are not engaged to start off with, start giving them access to this, start giving them training, and make sure that you kind of build out from there. So you're probably now thinking, well, what do we actually do? You've talked about metrics, you've talked about these two kind of approaches. Well, what do I do? Where's my action plan almost? So I'm going to kind of talk through one kind of general way of being able to do it in a question-based approach. So let's talk into that. So this is a really good diagram or kind of image from a book which is called Data-Driven Nonprofits. I'll add a link. I haven't realised I've not added a link to my notes, but I'll add a link to this. Would highly recommend it. The examples are a bit different because it's from US-based charities rather than UK-based kind of students' unions, but there are absolutely loads of parallels. It's about £15 on Amazon, for example, or obviously anywhere else. It talks about all these different ways that you can improve data, how you can really embed data into your organisation. And that's something that I think is massively powerful. We're just going to be looking up to kind of point 2, looking at insight for today. But do feel free to reach out if you want to talk about kind of predictive and prescriptive analytics going forward. So as you can see, the general steps that it talks about, where it starts at this idea of what actually happened, this baseline, being able to understand there, mapping out of your data and everything, then looking on to understanding, well, what happened and how do we analyze that to actually make it useful. And then the last, looking how do you put that into insights, things like dashboards, like I mentioned, and alerts and things. So that's how you kind of make it proactive so you can use that going forward. So as I said, let's kind of talk through a general example. We're going to talk through a question-based example. Can kind of talk through that because I think a lot of unions will probably start there most likely. So we're going to talk about how you kind of get from nothing to this idea of a dashboard so that you can present that to stakeholders, students, for example. So the question that we've got as a kind of general starting point is how do we improve overall engagement with elections? And then what we'll do is we start with that question above, but there are some different ways that we can change this question. So it's even before you potentially start looking at actual statistics, looking at data, it's worth looking at the question itself in the first instance. So some questions from here that you might kind of start asking are, how many students are already voting, that's mentioned there, what sort of college kind of demographic information can we apply to that? But some things that we can start applying kind of thereafter to take this idea that I mentioned from a good to a great metric is looking at things, are they first-time voters? Because that's a really powerful metric. Have they voted before this year? Because you might find that some students haven't voted before because maybe they don't have an understanding. Have they voted in all the elections that they're eligible for? Because those sort of questions, rather than just looking at how do we break down the current engagement, could actually allow you to forecast and kind of embed this engagement from your students. So rather than seeing kind of a single year spike where you've seen 20% increase in overall engagement, you can actually use some of those metrics and statistics to then make sure that you're keeping that engagement over subsequent years. So yes, let's talk about kind of what do we do then from this point. So the easiest thing to get started is to look at data mapping. So data mapping is understanding all the information from your union, kind of mapping and writing that down. Easiest place to start, good old pen and paper, just literally get a notepad, get a pen and start writing it down. The best place to start are things like systems and processes. So some systems could be like staff processes technically, and rather than digital systems, but a lot of the time you are going to look at digital systems, which we'll talk about in a sec. So here's kind of a quick example of a very simple way. So on the left, where you could just literally map it out. This system interacts with this system, interacts with this, for example. And then on the right, it's a bit more complex, where it's kind of looking at more towards kind of database design. You can do, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, you can do very varying levels. If your union, you very much need that top level approach, just do that top level approach. It'll be very kind of appropriate for your union where you start. You will kind of start to notice as you do some of these processes that how your internal processes might be quite ingrained and a lot of them might be inconsistent. So a big thing that's worth noting is that alongside kind of looking at these different things is being aware that it might actually make sense to do kind of general digital transformation alongside this. because it'll very much kind of pay dividends in the future, making, processes consistent, for example. So it's easier for students, but as I said, we'll talk about it in a little while. Here's a kind of an example of how complex you can really go. Don't worry about kind of reading through this. It's just an example I've pulled off the web. And I said it'll be in there later. But it's just showing kind of different ways that you can kind of map that information, that you can go kind of from very high level and then to very in depth. It depends obviously on the relative staff member, what you kind of need to get across. A good thing for this, which I think is worth noting, is that everything is very nicely kind of presented. So it's a bit more engaging, because it is a kind of almost a marketing piece that you're going to have to do alongside this. So you need to kind of make sure that, it's easily accessible for staff as well where possible. This is from a really good website, which I would recommend, and there is a free version called Vertibello. Potentially I might mispronounce that, but it's something that I would have kind of, feel free to have a look. It's got a free education license, so great tool, so you don't have to pay for it. Something that is worth noting on these sort of documents is that they are very much living documents. So don't necessarily worry about, okay, how do I map out everything? Just map out, start somewhere, start small, and slowly start mapping out from there. And as I said, you can make it as complex or as simple as you need. You very much might do a very top level diagram, which I'll show you in a little while, or you could do a really complex one like this. So you might find that maybe you're stuck on, well, actually mapping out the specific data points. So a good place to maybe take a step back, if you kind of do get a bit stuck with that, is then mapping out your data sources. So that are things like CMS, CRM, so that's if you're on MSL, One Voice, Sums, whatever. That's the sort of platform that you'd map out there. Things like your EPOS, if you have a separate EPOS for maybe your bar or your commercial services. Don't forget things like external services that you might use, kind of small ad hoc, so like your SurveyMonkey, your Google Analytics, because all of that information, it's worth being aware of it, and then maybe you might omit it later if you really need to. So as I said, here's a kind of a very higher level example of how you can map out these different data sources. What I do is I kind of start on that first ring going, okay, the external or the EPOS, CMS, for example, and then slowly build out from there saying, this is the context, this is the information that it actually has, sort of thing. So for example, we've got elections, activities and member data in your CRM, for example. So you've got your data, hopefully you've mapped all your systems, you've got access to your data, you've understood what you can maybe download and pull onto a local drive, for example. Your next step then is kind of starting to analyze it. The best place that I'd say to do that is looking at something like Excel, because most staff are going to have access to that. Start doing things like aggregating your data, start grouping it together, doing counts to it, so how many people in this school, college is appropriate, trying to get this further context. Another kind of thing is there is also to look at data over time. So like this elections idea, if you've got a week of elections, then actually what's the difference over time? So if you're looking at, say, the college, look at how that changes throughout that week, because you might find that you have a certain spike in the first week, in the first day, but then, a couple of days later, you might find that you see another spike. And I'm very much that idea of looking at that when. You might also, that'll allow you to do things like correlations. So say, for example, you see a big spike midweek, you might find that, well, the reason that's occurred is because you've done a mailer, maybe you've sent staff out patrolling to a specific building or space. The big thing for those is to actually kind of almost circle them and go, well, why is that happening? Because the big thing there is you can start building these hypotheses and going, well, actually, can we kind of test some of these? Can we do almost like A/B testing to say, let's go and try one this day, let's go and try something else this day, and start doing tests with that data.
Aidan, we've got a question from Caris. They've asked,
yes.
In terms of data mapping, do you see this as something that departments do or a central team does to have one large map of everything?
It very much depends on the structure of your union, to be fair, I think, and kind of where your digital staff are, potentially, or where you potentially more kind of digitally inclined staff are. Realistically, I'll probably start it with one person and maybe have that person build out. So kind of say, okay, so I'll just jump back a sec. So for like this exercise, I'll probably start it with one person, maybe two, to be able to springboard it off someone. And then also this one as well. So, looking at all your different systems. Some good staff that are kind of good to contact depending again, obviously on the structure of your union, maybe like one of your senior marketing staff, because they'll understand all of the different kind of CRM stuff that you might have. But your big thing is almost just to start conversations. What you could, like a couple of different ways you could do it that way, where one person starts and just branches out from there. Or if you've got like a team meeting, do this as like a team exercise, because you might find, because one of the things we'll talk about kind of processes later, you might find that some staff maybe have access and accounts to certain things that you're not aware of. So maybe do like 5-10 minutes of like a staff team meeting, loads of paper, or obviously if it's digital, if it's remote, and go, cool, what systems are you using? What are you using day to day? And that'll allow you to build that big picture. So yeah, feel free to ask some more questions a bit further. Cool, grand. Where was I up to? This one, cool. So you've started to do your analytics, you start to do that analysis. The big thing now is kind of presenting that data. So it's starting to put it in front of someone. Here are a few tools which kind of are very much worth looking at. So I did mention Excel. You can do pretty much all of this process in Excel. If you already have Excel and you don't want to pay anything else yet, you don't want to invest in it, then you can do that. I'll show you a bit of an extreme example on the next slide. Tableau is another one that I'd kind of strongly recommend. As you can see there, you can get for like £55. There's a link in the description as well for that. That's just through Charity Digital, which you can sign up to that for free and then get Tableau, I think, for 2 licenses for £55 for I think 2 years or something. So I very much would recommend it because it's quite industry standard. So if you're looking to kind of springboard staff longer term, it's quite good for them. So yeah, as I said, you can use Excel. This is an Excel kind of dashboard that I found. So if you've got any kind of staff that are very much Excel wizards within your organization, this might be a good kind of starting point. You can build stuff like this. It can be a bit more difficult to build because Excel is not necessarily built for doing this sort of thing, or not as extreme as this. So it might be worth looking into something like Tableau, which is this example here. So it's a very similar sort of dashboard. As I say, I would personally recommend Tableau because it's something that I've used a hell of a lot before and it's quite industry standard. One of the advantages something like Tableau maybe compared to Excel or other platforms is that you can drill into the data on here. So for example, if you can see that kind of where it says 62 out of 100 pie chart, you can actually click through that and then it will filter subsequent data. And so it allows you to ask this initial question, but then maybe drill into it further to go, actually, well, how does this impact, what change does this have? Do people less engaged if they're in this group or that sort of thing? A useful thing to note about dashboarding is about color. Try to limit your color. You don't want to have 50 colors across your dashboards because it's really complicated. And also be aware of color from an accessibility perspective. Try not to do kind of your red, amber, green sort of thing because it's not potentially as accessible as you think. But try and keep it within kind of 3 to 5 colors and try to rely on the color to be like, okay, if it's red, therefore it's a bad thing. Maybe, put text and things like that as well. And then, yeah, the last part, just to be aware of kind of like dashboarding is you're trying to tell a story. The easiest way that you're going to get engagement from other staff is that, if it tells a story about your election, there's, this is why we were so good. This is sort of the impacts that this had, and therefore this is what we can do in the future. So it's looking at, this dashboard. Ideally, want to be able to pick it up in like 30 seconds of opening it up. They open it up, they go, this is exactly what it's telling me. This is how I can engage with it, and hopefully then get some further answers for themselves. So as I said, that's kind of the dashboarding, metrics and section. So you'll have gone through that process and you've realized that there's some holes in your data, which is fine. That's quite understandable. But the big thing then is to look at, well, how do we kind of plug some of those holes? So you might kind of do things for like processes where you realize that there's data missing. You might be aware that, there's paper-based forms, which we'll talk about in a sec. But one of the things what you want to also look to do is not just tracking that, say you've had X amount of new activities this year or X amount of new activity applications this year. You can also, if you're tracking actual points between those, you can track things like success rate. So you could say, okay, we've had 10 new student activities start the application, but 7 of those therefore giving us a 70% success rate have got to the end. And here are the different points that people have dropped off at. Because then from that you can then kind of do that approach, kind of review your processes and use that data to actually benefit your organisation. A thing on that is very much to be aware that you need to take a student-first approach. Put the students at the heart of all of these processes. Being a student going through, for example, a new activity process, sometimes you can get a form that's like 10 pages long and you're going, I'm already disengaged. Like, how can you look at things like, can you say, take that, say, 10-page form, split it down into maybe 10 one-page forms? I know it's obviously, it might seem like more, but actually it'll allow you to take those students through that process, get that initial kind of interest, and then take them through it. And then obviously assess. It might see that you get certain students disengage with some processes, some parts, some with others, and obviously refine that as you go along. One very useful thing for kind of process mapping is this thing called swim lanes, because it kind of allows you, and it's a very great tool because it allows you to kind of map out how different people interact, what your processes are, because every time it crosses over a line, so you can see here where the student's going to the administrator, to the registrar, then to the faculty. Every time it crosses over, there's friction, which therefore makes it more difficult. It's more likely for take longer to be able to get from point to point. It's more likely for someone to actually disengage and drop off at that point. So it's how do you reduce and simplify and make it easier for a student. One advantage of these sort of diagrams is it does increase accountability. So you might find that students are dropping off kind of at this one of the further points. You can then look at that accountability and go, well, how long did it take to get there? Why were they dropping off there? Was staff taking too long? So you can look at that for these constant improvements as a team. And then a big thing that I'd push, because I've seen this and we did it as well. We did, when I started, we were very much paper-based forms. Digitize as much as you can. This is not a push for me personally, but it will massively benefit you as a union. Use something like Google Forms. Your CRM will probably have something like a surveys module, for example. There's a really good one that I found about called Email Me Form the other day, or like Survey Monkey, because that means that there's not that possibility for that loss of translation. If you've seen my handwriting, you definitely won't be able to read it if I put my information on a form. So just digitize it from day one and start doing those sort of things. And then one of the last couple of things is about how do we increase staff engagement? So, you know, maybe have started in your kind of silo team and you want to get more staff engagement, you want to get more staff kind of using this information and becoming data-driven as a full organisation. So here are the kind of some ideas that we've kind of noted. So it's doing things like, you know, key staff members. So it might be a case, whether that's budget holders, it might be kind of a few kind of data champions within each department. Those will allow you then to disseminate this information out. So it's kind of looking at those, looking at maybe a specific department. Maybe you're doing a review on your activities department for this next academic year, taking into account the impacts of COVID and how maybe you bounce back. So use that as a starting point and then build from there. And then the last one, which I would really recommend, is kind of hosting this idea of like knowledge shares. So this sort of session, but do that for the rest of your team. So that's kind of, you know, whether that's kind of a bit of a training sort of process where you practice it, where you're very much kind of trying to say this is how good and how you can use it, or whether it's a one department going, this is how we have used data and how awesome it has allowed us to be. So all of those should be good kind of starting points. You're going to have to kind of change them as appropriate for your organisation, but they should hopefully be kind of good starting points. So the one kind of last thing to take into account, we're almost done. Feel free if you've got any questions that you want. The last thing is kind of take ownership of your data. Be aware that, okay, you might have your data, stuff might go wrong, but actually you wouldn't have been, or you might not have been aware of actual kind of some of these other factors if you've not done this process. You might have gone, well, we're getting more advice cases, but we don't know why. Well, actually, potentially with a data-driven approach, you might be able to highlight what those issues are. And therefore you might be able to resolve that before it gets to that advice stage, you know, before you're getting this idea of potential dropout students. So very much kind of own that data, because it will give you that positive impact over time. And it definitely will kind of benefit your students' union overall. And yeah, that's, as I say, that's everything. Feel free to throw some questions in the chat and I'll kind of pick those up in a sec. And then please do stay in touch. So there's my email. Feel free to kind of reach out on LinkedIn. more than happy to kind of have a discussion about this if it's something you're looking to implement in the near future. Just have a chat. And as I say, check out Elbow Space's website. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Aidan. We've got our first question in the chat from Dana at Hearts. She wants to know, where do you, right at the start, where do you go about this? If you've got multiple departments with multiple different data, ways of storing it, you know, how do you start bringing it all together?
Yeah, if you're in 100 different spreadsheets, which worryingly I have been there, and it's a nightmare, your big thing in the first instance is bringing that on into one location. So whether that's like on a central intranet, whether that's on something like Google Drive, so that all that information is at least in one place. Because otherwise you might have, you know, someone's got a spreadsheet on their local machine and therefore you can't do anything with it. So once that's all in one place, then I'd potentially start looking at, can we maybe push that into like our CRM? Could that be on your sums MSL One Voice, for example? So could you pull some of that information and put it into a system that you already have? If you can't do that, because occasionally it might not be feasible, it's not a feature maybe, put that into something like a database. So whether that's like an Access, Microsoft Access database, so it's all in one place, then what you can do from there is then start doing analysis on that information. Because once you've got that all together, that's the big step there. The fact that you're aware that there might be 100 different spreadsheets is actually a good thing. I've worked with unions before and they've gone, well, we have data and that'll be about it, where it's like, actually, let's be aware of where we might have issues. Once you've then started kind of collating that data and putting that in one place, you can then start doing data analysis straight on there, whether that's kind of pulling out some high level aggregations. So, you know, looking at counting different engagements for certain things and pulling that into almost like an analysis spreadsheet to start off with maybe. But your big thing, if you actually do have 100 different spreadsheets, pick a chunk, start there and slowly kind of add further data in, sort of thing. That would definitely be something I'd advise. I hope that answers your question. Feel free to ask something else.
I've got a question, Aidan. So I think we all have lots of data.
Yep. We
can correlate that. We can start doing things without putting data streams together. But it's, how do we, if we're data rich and insight poor, how do we drive that insight? I mean, it's all very well having a spreadsheet, but how do you inform that? How do you put it in your strategic plan? How do you make it part of your processes, I guess, is the bit that probably most of us aren't really doing.
Start that in a couple of different ways. From a process perspective, it's being aware of what you're actually capturing throughout that process. I know a lot of unions that I've worked with before will capture information at the start and at the end, whereas actually you can put a lot of different points between that beginning and end, so that you can then track the engagement throughout that process. Whether that's within like your CRM, your CMS sort of platform or wherever, but being able to track that from beginning to end. Once you've then got that sort of thing so that you can then track, you know, your processes are robust, you can actually then look to improve them. From that perspective, it's then, as I say, that collating, putting everything, like you mentioned, correlating everything together, and then putting those into that dashboard and then circulating that back to your staff. Because once staff have access to that, they can then start actually then doing those questions. They can start questioning it like yourself for, say, a strat plan. Because ideally you want to build, your strat plan wants to be built off the data over the longer term at least, whereas your data doesn't want to be built necessarily off your strat plan, from my perspective. I think it wants to come that way around, because you're understanding what is happening and therefore you're able to inform your strategic plan from there. Your strat plan obviously will give you that overarching, this is what we want it to improve, but using that data obviously to benefit it.
Thanks. And we've got a final question for you, which is about how do we ensure the reliability of our data?
Yeah, so that's, like I mentioned, obviously you can kind of run into issues where you've got holes in your data and things like that, where things maybe are paper-based or whatever. The thing that you can do with that, so if you're pulling things onto, say, something like Google Forms, for example, so you're digitizing those forms, you can do things like validation to say you can only put a 0 or 1 here, or you can only put an email address, and it's standardizing that information. A big thing you can also do is standardize and be aware of like a single identifier for students. So I've worked with unions before where they've used actually an email in one platform, a student email in one platform, whereas a student ID in another one. Just decide that using one of those and then you'll be able to connect all of that together longer term. and kind of this idea about having little confidence in it, that's fine. Like you're not necessarily going to want to jump into doing this and starting it straight away. If you're aware that you've got, issues with kind of the quality of that data, the fact that you're starting that process is going to benefit you, because what you then do is you almost can start building kind of a framework, say, here are our standards for emails, here are our standards for things like address and this information, and then you enforce that going forward. Because then once you've enforced that going forward, you know that any new data is then within the correct format and build from there. And then what's the last one? Hopefully that helps. Feel free to ask another question if you've got them there. And then with the process potentially being quite lengthy, data sources across departments, iterative. It depends how you want to do it and how much buy-in that you've got from that last question about should it be iterative or not. If you're quite kind of data first already and reasonably data driven and quite engaged there, and potentially where your CEO or your senior management are kind of interested in investing in it, you could spend the time, like it is worth doing it. If you're kind of maybe just starting off on this journey and you're aware that you've got a hell of a lot of data that you need to kind of collate, start with a question-driven approach. So start maybe with like, okay, I've got this elections is going to be our thing, or welcome/freshers is going to be our thing. Start there, because once you can kind of show to the rest of your team that here is the power of this, here is the benefit of it, or strat plan kind of, here's the return on investment, you can then take that back and go, look, this is how it benefits us as an organization. Because you might find that once you've done that, you can actually say, well, actually, we need a data analyst role, or we need someone that's specifically going to be insights and data. So kind of use that to your benefit. Start maybe that question approach. If you're aware that you have a lot of data points, though, then you might already be a little further through than you think. It's just kind of balancing that time.
Huge thank you to Aidan. If you join the session late, you'll be able to find the recording on the studentsunions.co.uk website later on today. Thanks all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Hope you have more sessions you can go to, and I'm sure I will see some of you in future sessions.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.